Hey guys, welcome back to As a Man Thinketh on Yanasa TV, where I try and keep you informed of agricultural policies impacting farmers across the United States. Today I wanted to talk about something that has to do with the state of Idaho. Many of you probably remember that last year there was a massive water curtailment that impacted nearly 6,000 farmers in the state of Idaho, where they literally cut off the water after the farmers had planted potatoes. They had put all the investments into their crops, they had put everything in, and then they cut off the water. Even the period of the curtailment before there was a resolution had somewhat of an impact on crop yields because those farmers had to stop watering crops that require a lot of watering. And we all love our potatoes from Idaho, right? Well, they definitely had an impact even in that short period of time.
On May 31st, Idaho Department of Water Resources Director Matthew Weaver issued a curtailment order for 6 groundwater districts. Is that a big deal?
It's estimated that about 500,000 acres are subject to curtailment, which is half of all the groundwater acres in the eastern Snake River Plain. So for many reasons, that's a very big deal.
Good morning, friends. Welcome back to As a Man Thinketh on Yanasa TV. So today I wanted to talk about what's going on in Idaho, because some of you have probably heard about this, but the state of Idaho has put a water curtailment order, which is basically a water shutoff order on literally 500,000 acres of farmland. That's a lot of potatoes. A lot of these farmers, this impacts about 6,400 water users, but a lot of these farmers that are farming this land have already invested thousands of acres, thousands of dollars per acre to grow potatoes.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Trevor Belknap. I operate a family farm, a fifth-generation family farm in the Snake River Valley of eastern Idaho. And I just wanted to visit with you for a minute about the impacts of the water curtailment order that's been issued by Director Weaver from the Idaho Department of Water Resources. The situation in which we find ourselves is about as bad as it gets. Not only will we be out of business, many other businesses will be highly impacted, and you, as my friends and neighbors, will also be impacted because we're so interconnected. If the ag economy in eastern Idaho fails, which it surely will if this curtailment order is in place, it can remain in place, will dry up and blow away, just like it did back in the Dust Bowl of the 30s. Banks will fail. Equipment dealers, car dealers, gas stations, grocery stores, all rely on the ag economy that's here in eastern Idaho. The children in our schools, how many of them belong to families who work in some form of ag industry in eastern Idaho? It's horrible, and we need to fix it. And I would propose to you that it is not a water problem, it's a management problem, because we have water. Reservoirs are full, the mountains are covered in snow, the river's been flowing well. So why now? Why, after we've planted our crops, we have crops in the ground that are already growing, now in the middle of June, they pull a curtailment order to say, you must cease pumping water. The cost is huge. An acre of potatoes costs upward of $4,000 an acre to grow. How will that ever be recovered? They will not grow without water. And what will that do to everyone else that's reliant upon us in this area and the state of Idaho? What will the counties do for roads and bridges, police departments, ambulances, hospitals that rely on the tax base? Property like this will become worthless. Without water, the land doesn't have any value here. What will they do? We need to consider these things, and we need to talk to our elected officials. We need to call them now and push on them to find a workable solution, a compromise that will allow businesses like ours to continue to progress and grow and succeed in the Snake River Valley, and allow those in the southern part of the state to also continue to go. We need to work together to find a common solution, or we're all going to fail.
This is an economic war that is going on in the state of Idaho between surface water users and groundwater users. A lot of the farmers are groundwater users. Some of them are surface water users, but the main surface water users are not people that you would normally think of. The farmers, though, in this case, they're not just up against the cobalt mines, and I think the cobalt mines are rather interesting because when we get into this, you'll see that money that we pass to go to aid in Ukraine is actually going to this Australian cobalt mine in Idaho. And the reason for that is the U.S. Department of Defense is preparing for World War III. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. We need that cobalt for our weapons, for our national security. It's not going into electric vehicles like a lot of people say, or these other things. It is actually going into our defense. We can't rely on China if we end up in war with China to supply us with cobalt for our weapons. So I think that there's a big issue there as far as, you know, it's one of the only cobalt mines in the United States. It is one of the largest cobalt strips in the United States. There's also cobalt in Montana, not far above, you know, the Idaho cobalt area, but it does bring into question, you know, do we have to have this cobalt for our national defense? And if so, you know, what does happen to farmers out there? Meta, for example, is building a data center in the state of Idaho and has surface water rights. From what I know, they have surface water rights. The other major user in this area, I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to this, but Meta is opening these massive data centers, close to 1 million square feet in some locations. And they're opening one right there in Idaho. And they're going to be another competitor for groundwater because they use a ton of groundwater to cool their system. Some people said as much as an Olympic swimming pool a day. It's not as much as an Olympic swimming pool a day. Olympic swimming pools are 660,000 gallons. They're using as much as 2.5 million gallons of water a day to cool their systems. There's also the power company in the state of Idaho. The amount of surface water that flows down the Snake River is extremely valuable to the power company because it creates more power.
What happened to the other 1.5 million acre feet? Where does that go? Well, it goes all over the place, except eventually it goes back into the Snake River, down to Idaho Power.
Frank Vandersloot, in one of his interviews, brought up an interesting point to me. And that was that on April 19th, that's when the Idaho Department of Water Resources made a press release on their website kind of announcing that this was a problem and that these farmers could face curtailment. At that time, Idaho Power stock reversed rather dramatically. It had been falling, and it dramatically reversed.
Is the stock price from IDACorp, that's the parent company of Idaho Power. On April 18th, by the way, the stock had been going down until April 18th, the governor's office announces that they're turning off the water to this area, the groundwater. Then the stock price of Idaho Power jumps, and it jumps again the next day and the next day and continues to go up for the next 30 days. Okay, this was the turnaround day. That was the low. Everything turned around. Why does that happen? Why does, when the governor says, I'm going to turn off the farmer's water, does the stock price of Idaho Power jump?
A lot of people could look at this and say, okay, well, based on his description of where the water goes, increased water flow on the river obviously creates more energy, and therefore Idaho Power benefits the most. Nobody's pointing fingers at Idaho Power, and I think it's important to remember that Idaho Power could simply just be an investment strategy here. But you know, the point is they made a tremendous, their stock price made a tremendous reversal on the release of this news. Another key correlating date is when they went out around June 11th to actually start shutting off wells. You started seeing a high volume of shares trade of Idaho Power.
Then there's this question. This is a graph of the amount of shares traded, okay? Now, it normally runs about 300,000 on average, 300,000 shares traded of IDACorp per day. Until June 11th, which is the date the governor actually they send these people out to actually shut down the wells. They start red tagging wells and turning off wells. On that day, the volume, the number of shares traded that day of Idaho Power go from 300,000 to over 1.3 million shares in that day.
Well, last year, in order to solve the conflict between surface water users and groundwater users, the governor of Idaho had come up with a plan. That plan has yet to be implemented because the state Senate still hasn't approved a budget for the plan.
Senate Bill 1128 would deliver on Governor Brad Little's goal to invest millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, into water infrastructure projects across southern Idaho. The water mitigation agreement reached late last year secured a deal between the surface users and the groundwater users who've been at odds for years. Well, now the signed deal might be unworkable if lawmakers don't deliver a funding mechanism. Here's Joe Paris.
A successful water agreement between surface and groundwater users through eastern Idaho was a highlight across Idaho in 2024. It took months of hard work, tough conversations, and creativity to find a solution on how water should be used and preserved.
My Keeping Promises plan helps tackle the backlog of unfunded water projects.
Governor Little kicked off the 2025 legislative session with a call to action. Lawmakers needed to help water managers and agriculture operations successfully execute the new Idaho Water Agreement. Investments appear in the form of legislation, like Senate Bill 1128, a commitment to $30 million in ongoing investments for water infrastructure projects. The proposal sailed through the Senate, but is now treading water in the House Resource and Conservation Committee.
You know, if I'm being honest, it's a little bit frustrating.
We first introduced you to Blackfoot farmer Adam Young last summer. At the time, a water mitigation agreement was up in the air, and there were real concerns that surface water farmers like Young would have their water cut off. In the end, though, surface and groundwater camps compromised.
We did come to a deal that I think is a good deal. I think it's very workable, but it's going to require some pretty major investments in water infrastructure projects in our area and in the Twin Falls area.
Senate Bill 1128 accomplishes that. Ongoing money to supplement what farmers in water districts are already planning on spending major money on. All of this to ensure the water deal agreements are met.
And for reasons that I don't fully understand, that bill is being held in committee, although it's got broad support in the Senate, and my understanding is very broad support in the House.
You have to have that consistency and that certainty that is going to allow you to move forward with those projects. That's huge, and it absolutely must happen.
Representative Ben Furman of Shelley, Idaho, has followed the issue closely.
I'm a financial planner. I work with markets. The worst thing you can do for a market is create uncertainty. And that's what we're doing right now for our farmers, is creating this uncertainty.
So which means that all of these groundwater users are getting closer and closer to the possibility of having another curtailment this year if they can't resolve the issue.
So what happens if lawmakers can't or don't deliver for whatever reason?
At the very least, it becomes much more difficult to carry out, if not impossible altogether.
We're working on it daily, hourly. It's not something that's going to go away in our minds. We're going to stay here until we get it done.
I think that in the end, I think good people will do the right thing and it will prevail. But we have to keep that pressure on. We have to let them know how important it is.
Those of us who are on the ground aren't really interested in the politics of this. We just want to move forward with what we need to do to be able to make things work. It's hard to understand why the legislature, after what we experienced last year, would be holding this up.
And you might have picking up the tone of optimism by some lawmakers that we spoke with for that story. And I've spoken with lawmakers that didn't appear in the story that say whether it's Senate Bill 1128 or a different version of it, they are working hard to figure this out. Brian, at the same time, though, we can say, trust us, we're the news media, trust us, we're lawmakers. For farmers that are across eastern Idaho that work so hard to get this deal done, you could hear the frustration. You saw the frustration from people like Adam Young.
Now, from what I understand, a lot of the members of the Senate and the members of the House for the state of Idaho are dedicating as much time as they can to solving this budget issue so that they can actually implement their plan. But the state of Idaho is actually taking it a step further. So that what they're doing is they're expanding the Snake River Basin's groundwater user curtailment zone. One of our subscribers from Lost River, Idaho, which is in the area of the cobalt mines, which many people have had a question of whether or not those cobalt mines have anything to do with the surface water issues, sent me a letter from that they had received from the Water Resources Department. Now, this letter is a notice of public hearing on the expansion of the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer area of common groundwater supply to include tributary basins. Now, according to the letter and according to what I've read online, the Water Resources Department feels that they have the right to make this expansion. What does that expansion actually mean? What it means is that they can offer more protectionism to their surface water users. They can include more people in the water curtailment and impact even more farms on the next curtailment. And I don't really know how all of this works, because none of these people that they're going to be including into this new pact have had anything to do with the negotiations that have taken place before. But you would think that they should have something to do with it, and you would think that those negotiations would have to be redone, because now you're accepting in more land, more farms, more groundwater users into this aquifer restriction area. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, and it's going to be interesting to see what the longer term goal here is. Clearly what they have worked out in the past hasn't worked. That's why they ended up with the curtailment issue last year. You know, the other thing that I find interesting about all of this is that shortly after the curtailments last year, if you guys remember, I posted a video about this as well. I've posted numerous videos on what's been going on in Idaho, but shortly after that period, they ran a geographical survey of the land looking for additional resources of cobalt. If you are a farmer in Idaho, you might be noticing some low-flying helicopters with some cylindrical tubes on the front of them. These helicopters are nothing to worry about. They're just shooting radar deep down into the earth. It probably has no impact on you. If it does, just think of it as a free radiology treatment. And they are studying, they're doing a geological survey of your farmland in the surrounding areas, all the way up into Montana. I'm going to put a map up here so you guys can see where this geological survey is taking place. A lot of this is taking place in areas that you're probably familiar with the recent water curtailment. So Bingham County, Blaine, Bonneville, Butte, Clark, Custer, Jefferson, and Lemhi in Idaho. And then in Montana, there's Beaverhead, Deer Lodge, Madison, Silver Bow. All of these areas are along the Idaho-Montana Cobalt Belt. And basically, the purpose of the survey is to provide images that expand the fundamental knowledge of geology underpinning the Great Falls Teutonic Zone in the Montana-Idaho Cobalt Belt. The area of interest covers numerous focus areas that are prospective for critical mineral resources, and is designed to assist with the mapping of subsurface faults for earthquake hazard studies. They'll also be looking into the water flows out of the aquifer, so they can better understand the aquifer with this study. So this is a pretty big study. It's going to take several months. They have 2 helicopters that will be flying out, and they'll be flying pretty low. Some people have asked me if this has anything to do with the Idaho water curtailment, and my research points to yes. Now, after the curtailment, the governor did also order a geographical survey of where the water is coming from in the aquifer to try and figure out better ways of managing the aquifer. But the actual surveys that I'm talking about, the low-flying helicopters, those were looking for additional cobalt. And I find it kind of unusual that some of the farms that are in the same area that would be impacted by this expansion are in the areas where these geographical studies were being done. But none of this is going to make much of a difference. They could take all the water rights they want to and give it to these surface water users to continue to protect these surface water users who are, you know, in fact, senior rights holders. But they're not, that's the thing, is they're not senior rights holders of the areas that they haven't included yet. Now they're gonna give them senior rights over those people. Section 4233 in the Idaho State Legislature was enacted in 2024 after the initial curtailments. So none of these farms would have originally fallen into this. I don't know, the whole thing doesn't sit very well with me, and that's because I've done a lot of research on this topic, and I'm concerned, you know, and I did a video earlier this year talking about, you know, the fight for Idaho and how the resources of Idaho are still in question even with the Trump presidency. I don't think that Trump is going to be able to buy Greenland. And so therefore, what we're looking at are the resources that we have here. And I recognize the fact that we need to be an independent country. We can't be dependent on other countries. But what we're seeing in real time is a maneuvering of one of the most valuable resources in the world right now, which is water and water rights. And if we're not careful, if you're not careful as a farmer in those areas, you could end up in a situation where you can't water your fields, where you can't water your crops, where you're economically unviable. I think one of the things that could bring some comfort to everybody in the near term would be for the Idaho Senate and House to actually pass the spending bill that they need to put in place in order to fund a lot of the agreements that they had put in place last year during the curtailment. Because if they can't get that done, and we end up in another water curtailment, after the 24th of this public hearing, we could have a lot more farmers included in that curtailment. These farmers who haven't had a senior rights holder against their water will have one due to the protectionism that the state is offering through the Water Resources Department by expanding the aquifer restrictions. There's some interesting things going on out there in Idaho, guys. Kind of reminds me of a Yellowstone episode. I'm curious to see where all of this goes. I'm hoping that they find a viable solution. I'm a bit, personally, if I lived in Idaho, which at one point in time I thought about moving there, but if I lived in Idaho and I was one of those groundwater users and I got a letter in the mail that suddenly said, hey, look, due to protectionism, we're about to give your water rights to a senior water rights holder, and then you guys are going to have to be restricted so they get more water. And knowing that, who those senior water rights holders are is just, do people not care about our food supply anymore? Have we given up on our food supply for data centers, for power, for mining? Mining is important, and I'm not saying it isn't. I don't think the data centers are, personally. I kind of hate the whole data thing. Anyway, guys, stay tuned for more updates on this and other agricultural topics on Yanasa TV. I hope to talk to you guys again soon.